What's up, my emo, alt-rock, pop-punk music lovers? Matrix here, and you are locked into the Matrix Music Review Podcast, the only place to get your alt-rock music fix. Holy shit, it has been a minute since I've been with y'all. It has been a crazy end of this year. You know, right after I dropped that home team podcast, I definitely needed a little bit of a mental break. And then the snowball just kind of kept rolling, and pods just kept getting pushed and ended up not doing any for a few months there. So I'm sorry about that, but it is definitely something that I'm going to give you a big podcast here today to make up for it, and hopefully this will make up for it. And then as the new year starts, we're going to get right back into our normal schedule here. As always, the link for any social media for me is in the description of this episode. X, Instagram, TikTok, all of that is in this description. We do have a YouTube channel now. We are YouTube live. All of these pods are on YouTube now, so go over there and subscribe. If you're listening on Apple Music or Spotify, leave a 5-star review. It definitely helps. When we did the Wrapped at the end of this year, we saw an 80% gain, which is just crazy to me. Like, that is just crazy to me that everybody keeps coming back, everybody keeps listening, and y'all are enjoying what I'm doing. So I'm going to keep putting out that stuff for you so that you continue to get the music and discover the music that you love. Today is all about the year of 2024. We're wrapping the year up. And what a absolutely massive year this was for the alternative scene. I think we started out with some of these bigger bands coming back. Obviously, we got the return of Linkin Park with new vocalist Emily Armstrong, which I'll get into later in this podcast. We'll talk a little bit about that. We also had some mainstream blending, and I'm specifically referring to Knocked Loose getting a Grammy nomination for Suffocate with Poppy, and also just them being on mainstream television. Jimmy Kimmel Live, we had a performance of Suffocate on live TV, and obviously there was some backlash to that, which I think we all probably expected, but either way, that just goes to show that the alternative scene is thriving. The alternative scene is here to stay. It is back like it never left. And let's finish up, just with this thought of Warped Tour is returning next year. We talked about this numerous times. I have, at least on this podcast, about what would Warped Tour look like? What would we want it to look like? And I think we're still kind of a little out in the dark on what this is going to look like. But what I will say is it's not something that I'm willing to miss. I will be front and center at the DC date. First Warped Tour back in, I don't remember, 10 years? Is that what we're at? 10 years here? So I will be there, and hopefully I'll see a bunch of y'all there as well. And we should start getting that lineup soon in January. So once we start getting some bands and some acts on this lineup, we'll start talking about what it looks like. Also, let's just take a second to appreciate that Warped Tour's coming back, as well as When We Were Young Fest being a relative success this year. I think, the past couple of years we've had issues with weather or with venue, and yeah, there's always going to be hiccups with these festivals. There's always going to be something that doesn't go right. Nothing is ever going to be perfect. But for the most part, I think When We Were Young Fest went okay this year from what I've heard. Obviously, I know there was some issues with merch being spelled wrong and things like that, but overall, I think the experience for people was okay. And I think even more interesting is that obviously we have the lineup for next year already. Isn't it wild that they are returning with an entire playthrough of A Fever You Can't Sweat Out? That is potentially one of the biggest things that stood out to me this year, because we all know that Panic at the Disco said that they were done. They weren't doing anymore a couple of years ago after that atrocity of an album. I don't even remember the name of the fucking album. That's how bad it was. But here we are going into 2025 with a new festival that did really well this year with album playthroughs. Here we have one of the biggest bands in the scene from when we were younger coming back to play an album that potentially is on the Mount Rushmore of best alt-rock albums, pop-punk scene albums of all time. I think that is noteworthy, and I think that's something to watch going into 2025. And I'll do another podcast like we did last year about who to look for, what to look out for. But going into 2025 with Panic coming back to play when we were young, an entire session of A Fever You Can't Sweat Out, that's noteworthy, and it has my senses raised a little bit about, are we going to get new Panic music? And if we do, are we away from whatever the fuck that last album was? Because that would be a serious, serious change and a serious boost to this scene as well. So let's talk about this pod and how it's going to go. We are counting down the top 30 albums this year. I think I only did 20 last year, but this year was just too good. And of course, with me not doing pods for the end of the year, I definitely have to make up for that a little bit. So going to get into those in a minute. We're going to talk about some songs, some artists that I really enjoyed this year after that. And then we'll also count down some of my shows, my top shows that I went to this year before we end this pod. Before we start this album countdown, I need to address a very big missing piece of this podcast, or a big missing piece of this list. There is a notable band and a notable album missing from this top 30. And that is Posthuman Next Gen by Bring Me the Horizon. Now, I deliberated with myself over where they should fall in this list, if they should fall in this list, and what I needed to do with them. Ultimately, it felt like to me, this album was too much of the singles that we already had. The interludes didn't really do much to kind of boost this album for me. And while I really enjoyed some of the newer tracks like Top 10 Statues That Cried Blood and A Bullet With My Name on It, those are two of my favorite songs. I couldn't justify putting this in a top 30 when there was so much new music or so many new artists that released debut albums this year that I enjoyed more than putting this album in there just because it was Bring Me. So yes, they are not in this top 30. It does not mean that I did not enjoy that album. It just means for me, the top 30 albums this year, I feel like it's more important for me to highlight some of these albums more than Posthuman. So with that, let's talk about some honorable mentions before we get into our top 30 list. The first honorable mention that I want to talk about is Stigma by Wage War. Now, I may have been a little harsh on this back when this album first came out, but as I've had more time with this album, I really did enjoy what Wage War brought to the table here on Stigma. There's a lot of blending that goes on here. You get some heavy songs, you get some more melodic, mainstream songs like Magnetic, and I think what Wage War has done is just shown that they are just going to be consistent. They are always going to deliver a really strong album, a really strong vocal performance, and overall just a good experience with their music. So I did enjoy that album, and I'm glad that I went back to it a few more times. And then the second honorable mention I want to mention is The End by Your Broken Hero. One of the themes for this year for me was this nostalgia core, is what I'm calling it, where it is pop punk or metalcore or something that really takes us back to those early 2000s, mid 2000s, where all of these bands were dominating on the radio scene. And Your Broken Hero does that really well. I think had we had some newer tracks on there, some of the ones that maybe I hadn't heard already, like when I heard this album, I forgot that Tommy's Face was one of my favorite songs. I forgot all about that. But I think as we see this develop, I think it's going to be something that is more prevalent in the scene, this nostalgia core, this focus on bringing that sound back, but also putting their own spin on it. And I think Your Broken Hero did that really well this year, and I'm excited to see what happens with them. So with that, we're jumping into our top 30 albums of 2024, with number 30 being Scream It At Me by Fluorescence. This is Fluorescence's first full-length album, and there's a mixture of vocals, a mixture of lead vocals, I should say, between two of the members, and I think that really is something that stood out immediately to me. Because it's not like you just get 5 songs with one, 5 songs with the other. They break it up, they mix it up, and that pattern of not knowing who's going to be lead vocal on a particular track really does help break this album up. When we're talking about tracks on this album that are my favorite, I think Vibe is immediately the standout for me. It was one of my most played tracks this year. And the thing with Fluorescence is they have continued to release music all throughout 2024. They released this debut album, and within a few weeks, I feel like we got the next single, and it was not on this album. So I think 2025 is definitely looking up for Fluorescence. And I think this album could have been higher had I not known that there were so many singles off of this already and so many that I'd heard. But when you have a debut album that you can put all of this material together and it still is a cohesive unit, I think that's extremely impressive and worthy of a spot in this top 30. So number 30, Scream It At Me by Fluorescence. At number 29, we got Can We Start Over by Charlotte Sands. Another debut album here, and Charlotte has a very unique pop rock sound. It's pretty similar to what we got a little bit last year from Honey Revenge, and even this year with Lolo and Taylor Acorn. This pop rock scene is in such good hands, and again, you'll see that kind of throughout this episode and throughout this countdown, that there's a lot of pop rock going on in the scene as well as kind of like one of those subgenres. And I think that's important because all of these different subgenres are really helping to not make the scene feel stale. It doesn't feel like there's just one particular subgenre dominating and the rest are just kind of skating by on some of the elders of the scene. No, I think at this point we do have such a unique subset of artists that this scene is just going to continue to grow and surprise us. When we talk about Charlotte's album, Spite is probably my top off of here. And I think it's just kind of an interesting lyrical exposition here about getting famous out of spite. Back in early 2000s, you wouldn't be able to necessarily say that, but now with TikTok and with this viral fame that can happen overnight off of any little statement or anything like that, getting famous to spite somebody isn't out of the ordinary or isn't out of the question. So really interesting song here from Charlotte Sands. Really fun debut album. Number 29, Can We Start Over by Charlotte Sands. At number 28, we got Good Days, Bad Days by Home Truths. Another debut album here, and this is a band that I talked about a little bit last year. Their song Loser was one of my favorites from last year when I started this podcast, and this is just another one of those nostalgiacore albums that really just stands out above the rest. And I think a lot of times when I'm talking about these nostalgiacore bands, what's happening is there are a lot of newer bands. There are bands that maybe people haven't heard about. Home Truths might be that for a lot of you guys. But what I'm trying to do here is really introduce this sound to people that are consistently saying, well, it's not like the 2000s anymore. You know, we don't have the Fall Out Boys or the Mayday Parades. No, you're right. We don't have them. We still have them. They're doing their own thing and they're doing it pretty well. But we do have bands out there making stuff that is similar. It's not going to be exactly the same. It's not going to be the same feel because obviously we're getting older as well. However, give an album like Good Days, Bad Days by Home Truths a spin, and I'm telling you, you're going to be surprised at how much you like this. This is an album where it's pretty short, it's pretty compact, but all of the songs on here have a sound that really evokes that nostalgic feeling. And for me, it was hard to pick a favorite off of here, but Serotonin is probably what I would pick. This is one that was at the end of the year as I was kind of on my hiatus here, but it definitely works. This album is spectacular. Coming in at number 28 this year is Good Days, Bad Days by Home Truths. Coming in at number 27 for the year is Therapy Sessions by Costin. Kind of continuing the trend here with all of these debut albums, this is another debut in kind of that pop rock subgenre. And what's interesting about this is Costin's a Canadian band, and I think Canada is one of the more underrated scenes for this genre or just pop rock, pop punk in general. I think a lot of times we may not pay attention to where bands are from, but there's some good shit coming out of Canada. I was able to catch some of these bands live this year, and man, are they super, super impressive. Costin was one of my favorite discoveries this year because Strangers is such a huge hit, and I think the title of this album really is appropriate because when you listen to this album in full, Therapy Sessions is really something that is present all throughout. There's a lot of this introspective looking at what's going on in your life, and you can kind of feel that feeling of just trying to go through therapy on your own as you're listening to each song. And I think that's really important because we don't necessarily have an album title mean something like that all the way throughout an album anymore. But Costin does that really well. So number 27 this year is Therapy Sessions by Costin. At number 26, we have the self-titled Heart Bent from Heartbent. This is one of our emo entries on this that's a pretty consistent reach for me this year. And a lot of times when I'm coming up with this list of top 30, top 20, however many albums I decide to do, the question is, was it important in the scene? Was it something that was a debut that really stood out to me? Was it something that I consistently reached for this year to play, to listen to certain tracks? Anything along those lines is criteria for me for this album list. And with Heartbent, it was a pretty consistent reach for me this year. Again, we had the same kind of situation as we did with Fluorescence in the sense that we do have some altering vocals here, altering vocal lists. And again, that really helped to break up this album. Sanctuary was a really heavy hitter for me. And Sanctuary is one that kind of begins a little bit like a Linkin Park track to me. And then it just kind of explodes into this heavy hitting track. So if you're not familiar with them yet, please go check them out. But number 26 on the year is the self-titled Heart Bent from Heartbent. At number 25 this year, we have A Cure to Poison the World by The Requiem. When I did this album review earlier this year, I made a bold statement that The Requiem sounds very similar to My Chemical Romance. I still believe that comparison, and I still think that comparison holds true as I've listened to this album more and more throughout this year. This album didn't stay in rotation as much as I thought it would, but again, this was one that I threw on as a potential contender onto my list, and upon re-listen, I was like, oh my god, absolutely, this is a top 20, top 30 album this year. This is one that was not really single heavy in the sense that, like, oh, I can just grab a single off of there and listen to it consistently, but there were tracks on there that really stood out, like Less Than Zero and Kill the Lights. This is a band that really deserves more love and deserves more recognition in this scene based off of just this very initial introduction on A Cure to Poison the World. But I think if the Requiem continues to put out music like they did with this debut album, they are destined for great things in this scene. So at number 25 this year, we have A Cure to Poison the World by The Requiem. At number 24, we have Little Room to Breathe by Eternal Boy. This is the third album from the Pittsburgh pop-punk trio, and again, this is one of those nostalgia-core albums. It just kind of hits that sweet spot of, this is the type of music that I grew up on, this is the type of music that I still love, and for lack of better terms, their song Version of Myself really does kind of hit that and check all the boxes. This is just my interpretation of it, but the version of myself that I am listening to these types of tracks is the version of myself that I'm most comfortable with. And I think that having bands like Eternal Boy and like Costin and all of these different nostalgia core albums that we get throughout this year really does help people to be like, okay, you know what? This stuff is still out there. This stuff is still being created by bands that are new. It's not just the same 5 bands recycling material. So there is still a lot of love for this type of scene. So at number 24, Little Room to Breathe by Eternal Boy. At number 23, we have Growing Up on the Internet by No Offense. This is a super fun album with one of my top tracks of the year, Gibberish. This is a song that's kind of all about these mental battles that people don't always know are going on in their head and that other people may not recognize when they're having a conversation with you. And I think the line in there that says, "Ask me how I am, I haven't decided yet," really does play true. And it was definitely a line that stuck with me all this year. A lot of times when people ask you how you are, you just say, "Oh, I'm fine," or "Oh, I'm good." But there are some times where you say, like, "I don't know." And it's okay to say, "I don't know." It's okay to be like, "I don't know how I am. I'm not sure how I'm feeling. I'm not sure how all of this is going." But a song like this really hammers home that it's not just you feeling that way. It's not just you being the one that's like, "I don't know how I am yet. So not sure how you're going to continue to ask me that question." But this is a super tight album with 11 tracks that all just kind of check those boxes of a pop punk ish type album. I don't really want to label this with a specific subgenre because there are a lot of different things production wise that Noah does here that really work. And it was just a fun, like, it's just a fun album. That's all I've been able to say about this album all year is it's some of the most fun I've had with an album. And even a song like 3-Day Headache really stood out at the beginning of the year. So coming in at number 23 is Growing Up on the Internet by No Offense. Coming in at number 22 is Happy Saturday by Jack the Underdog. This is a production specialty here. This is fun pop punk from Jack the Underdog all throughout this album. There are multiple tracks that were huge for me. Sad Today, FFF, which stands for Fuck Fake Friends. I think we all can agree with that statement right there. And it just kind of continues the trend with debuts. I think we had a lot of really strong debuts from artists that may not be well known to people yet, but I think these are all artists that kind of hit that next level of, okay, they're about to step up in the scene. They're about to step up in, next level being, openers for some of our favorites. And then that's when really people will get to discover this great next wave of artists. So coming in at number 22 is Happy Saturday by Jack the Underdog. Coming in at number 21 is From Zero by Linkin Park. And now here's where the controversy starts, right? Because I'm starting to name artists that have been around the scene, and once you get past number 21, you might hear a name that maybe you haven't heard before, and that's when you all are going to start throwing the tomatoes at me saying, how the hell could you put a band like this behind? So let's start talking about From Zero from Linkin Park. Obviously, there has been controversy with Linkin Park returning. I don't think there's any way to sidestep that. I think everybody was kind of shocked at the return. And what I'm going to say about that is, while I was shocked at the return of Linkin Park, I was not unhappy with the return of Linkin Park. Linkin Park is a band that has been one of my top bands forever. And obviously, getting material without Chester as the lead vocalist and with Emily as the lead vocalist is going to be different. That's okay. Things are going to change. Things are going to be different. And I think when you separate the fact that this is just a new era of Linkin Park from the name, I think it makes it a lot easier to digest, because I think one of people's main problems is that they felt like they can't separate Chester from Linkin Park or Linkin Park from Chester. And I get that to a degree, but Emily came out absolutely swinging on this album. The Empty Mist Machine, as I think that was the debut lead single, holy fuck, like that is just an incredible track. And I think people would have really paid more attention to it if there wasn't such bullshit controversy around this. And I think the reason that it lands at 21 for me is just because I didn't spend enough time with it, and there are some places on this album where I'm like, oh, this really just doesn't work for me. And funny enough, the places that this album doesn't work for me is when Shinoda takes over. When he does a lot of the singing or he does a lot of the vocals, those are the tracks that I didn't care for. But when Emily's on lead vocals and really just going at it, that's where I'm enjoying this album the most, which I think is hilarious to me that I'm enjoying Emily more than Shinoda on this album, but that's a conversation for a different time. You know, I talked about the Emptiness Machine, and Heavy as the Crown is another one that really stood out. And I think Linkin Park is in really good hands. I think Linkin Park with Shinoda, with Emily as lead vocals, is really set up for success. And I think now that everybody's kind of gotten over this initial shock of having a new lead vocalist, I think it's going to really work out well. I think Emily was the absolute dynamite 100% right choice for Linkin Park and for the band. And I'm really interested to see how this tour goes and how the fans really react to this setup. I personally will try to get out to that show and see what I can discover and see what I see with it. But from everything that I've seen so far, I am ecstatic with the direction of Linkin Park. I am ready for this next chapter. Sad as it may be to never have Chester back with Linkin Park, I think it's something that I would rather have Linkin Park than not have them. And I think that's the way I've kind of looked at it. And Emily is fantastic, and I can't wait to see what else she's got in store for us here. So coming in at number 21 this year is From Zero by Linkin Park. Coming in at number 20 is Falling for Robots and Wishing I Was One by Lolo. Lolo is a storyteller to the core. This artist continuously tells us stories in every single track that we get. And even a song like Faceplant, which just sounds like a very simple pop rock, pop punk song, there's still a story about it because it's all about how, you faceplant every time you see this person. And in her case, she told the story of how she actually faceplanted in the middle of the street and then needed stitches. And that's how we got the single album art for that. But I think this album really was just missing those extra songs, and maybe we had too many singles on an album. It's very similar to that Fluorescence album that I talked about back at 30. I think Lolo just stood out more to me because there was so much more depth to what was being said and so much more expression in general. I think that's what made this album stand out for me and what has it landing at number 20 on the year, Falling for Robots and Wishing I Was One by Lolo. Coming in at number 19 is Heaven and Hell by Sum 41. This is the final album from Sum 41, and this album was emotional from the start because we knew that this was the last album from Sum 41. And it was emotional for me because I think when you hear an album or that it's going to be a band's last album, you almost expect it to be kind of this tapering off or this winding down of their career. And you almost want it to be something that you don't like because you know that you're not going to get anything new from them. And unfortunately, that did not happen here with Sum 41. Sum 41 was still top quality, was still top tier, and getting out to see them on the road this year was something that was important for me. And, being able to return to songs like Landmines and Time Won't Wait, and then also seeing all of this performed live really did just make me realize how important Sum 41 has been to the scene, and obviously losing them in the scene is something that is difficult. But again, with all the bands that say that they're done, I'm never going to say never with Sum 41. This Heaven and Hell record is a great way for them to go out, and it was something that I went back to several times this year. So if this is it, I'm glad that this is what we got to end it with. So coming in at number 19 on the year is Heaven and Hell by Sum 41. Coming in at number 18 is Death Can Wait by Being as an Ocean. Being as an Ocean's sixth studio album, these guys are genre blenders to their core because they have some hardcore elements, they have some melodic elements. I think when I talked about this album back in the beginning of the year, I referred to it as emo spoken word, which is still kind of true, but I think that might have been a misstatement there. This album is really just one that I continued to go back to because there was always just like one track that I wanted to hear. There was always one track that I was like, I kind of want to hear this track right now. So it's hard to have an album like this, especially with those different elements, those kind of spoken word elements, that also leads to your hardcore screams, that also leads to some melodies in there. It's really hard to kind of be a genre blender in that sense, but Being Is an Ocean did it extremely well on this Death Can Wait album. And some of the melodies were the ones that I found myself going back to, specifically a song like You Gave It a Voice. And again, this is a band that I think maybe some people are not familiar with. So to have them up at 18, there might be some eyebrows raised or things like that. But trust me, this is well worth this spot. So if you haven't heard it or you don't know the band, do yourself a favor. Go check out Death Can Wait by Being Is an Ocean, my number 18 album of 2024. Coming in at number 17 this year is the self-titled album from the Early November. This is their 7th album, and the Early November is kind of this alt-rock emo group. And the biggest thing that I wanted to say about this album is there is such meaningful storytelling and songwriting all throughout this record that make this album stand out above the rest. And this is an album that doesn't always get the playback that it deserves, because there is always just kind of this specific need with the Early November. Because of how well the songwriting is done and because of how unique their style is, it's not one that I'm always going to necessarily grab for when I'm driving somewhere, or it's not always one I'm going to grab for when I'm sitting down to do something at my day job. This is one that I sit down and I'm like, you know what? I'm in an Early November mood. I got to listen to that self-titled album. But when you do go back and listen to it, it is just spectacular. And I think that is where, for me, that's where this album kind of gets to. And I think that's something that a lot of people can appreciate, that there's always going to be some of those albums that they are spectacular, they are phenomenal, but they're not always going to be the one that you reach for because they are more meaningful lyric-wise than they are sound-wise. So coming in at number 17 this year is the self-titled album from the Early November. Coming in at number 16 is Analysis Paralysis by 4 Year Strong. This is the 6th album from 4 Year Strong, and this is an album that was clearly a favorite from you guys. And I think that's something that's wild to me, because I always put up polls on my Instagram about, is this an album of the year contender? Is this not an album of the year contender? And a lot of times what happens is one artist or two artists will post my poll on their site or on their page, and then some of their fans come in, and inevitably there's always going to be a few haters that are just saying no to everybody else and yes to the one that they saw on their artist page. But that didn't happen this year, because the 4 Year Strong Analysis Paralysis record was one that almost universally got a yes check mark next to it. And that was so interesting to me, because it was an album that I liked, but it wasn't one that I was necessarily thinking of as a potential even top 10 contender at the time. But when I went back and listened to it, there's so many classic sounds on here that still makes this record feel fresh. And I think that, again, is kind of the key to hitting a home run in this nostalgic horror time, is that if you're a band like 4 Year Strong that's been around for a little bit, the only way to keep yourself relevant in a game like this is to still know that you have this very specific sound that people want, but delivering some of these fresh sounds that new fans can find and be like, okay, yeah, I really do enjoy that, but it doesn't sound like the same old shit. And 4 Year Strong did that perfectly on Analysis Paralysis. And this really is just kind of the blueprint for some of those scene bands that are still running around trying to do this. And I think if you are a band in the scene that you've been around a while and maybe you're still trying to figure out how to remain relevant, you don't have to look any further than 4 Year Strong. Analysis Paralysis is a perfect example of how you can still be who you were while implementing things that are new and being successful. So coming in at number 16 this year is Analysis Paralysis by 4 Year Strong. Coming in at number 15 is Traumatic Livelihood by Jasmine Bean. This is another album that really kind of snuck up on me in terms of where this ended up landing on the list. But again, this is why I go back and re-listen to albums, because there are certain times where, an album has a lull for me where I don't always listen to it, or there's not a track off of it that I listen to. But when I go back and I re-listen to it, I can really appreciate the totality of it. And that's exactly what happened with this Jasmine Bean album. When I went back and re-listened, I was like, oh my God, Piggy and Shit Show and Favorite Toy are all just beautifully done. And I think this artist is so... I don't even know what the word is, because the songwriting and the storytelling from this artist are just so hauntingly beautiful that they are always going to be someone that I look towards if it's a new release week and Jasmine Bean is on the list. That's immediately going to jump to the top, because I know that there's going to be something that this artist has to say and I want to hear it. So I'm really excited to see where Jasmine Bean ends up in this scene, because they have just done such an extremely good job with this Traumatic Livelihood album that I really just can't wait to see what else. So coming in at number 15 this year is Traumatic Livelihood by Jasmine Bean. Coming in at number 14 is Blue Hour by Real Friends. This was Real Friends' first self-released album, and this record is pretty largely emotional. And I think when you look at an emotional record, there's always going to be one song that stands out, and I think Waiting Room obviously has to be that one for me this year. And, it just kind of hit at the right time for me. We did have a death in the family kind of this fall, this winter, and listening to an album like Blue Hour and listening to a song like Waiting Room, where they're talking about, taking the clothes to Goodwill, and, you thought that time would heal the wounds until I lost you, and all these different things. These are all lines that kind of have an extra added meaning when you're going through something very similar to an album like this, or similar to a song like this. So really impressed with this Blue Hour album from Real Friends. It's one that I can't go back to super often right now just because of the headspace that I'm in, but it is definitely a fantastic album, a fantastic emotional record, and definitely deserving of the number 14 spot on my list this year. Coming in at number 13 is Negative Spaces by Poppy. Now, this album was probably the toughest decision for me, because unfortunately I'm suffering from a little bit of recency bias here with Poppy. I know that the album came out relatively recently, and it was one that I really didn't get a chance to listen to a whole lot, or listen to as much as I would have liked. But everything that I keep hearing when I listen to this album just kind of slams me and says, this is at least number 13 or number whatever for the year. And it was really hard keeping this out of the top 10, but ultimately I think 13 is where Negative Spaces needs to land. And Poppy is an artist that this year really just kind of defined 2024. We had Poppy featured on Violence Against Nature with Bad Omens on that deluxe record. We had Poppy release their own album, Negative Spaces, which was a fantastic record. And we had Poppy featured on the biggest song, potentially the biggest song of the year in the scene, in Suffocate with Knock Loose. And for me, I think that's where this album needs to land. And knowing all of those things, Poppy deserves a spot where they're at. And Poppy was just all over the place this year. And I'm really excited to see what they do moving forward. So coming in at number 13 is Negative Spaces by Poppy. Coming in at number 12 is I Want to Disappear by The Story So Far. And again, this is another one of those classic blueprint albums for pop punk. The Story So Far has been all over the scene the past decade, and I Want to Disappear is just phenomenal. It may be their best record that I've ever listened to. And again, there's some emotion behind this. There's some emotion behind a song like Letterman, and there's an emotion behind, the title track. And I think, again, All of these emotional records are fantastic, and they do have a very specific place, and it's tough sometimes to go back to them and listen to them over and over again. But specifically the story so far, it wasn't that hard because of the up-tempo songs or the up-tempo tracks that you get behind it. And then when you dig into it a little bit, obviously you get this emotional feeling behind it. But I Want to Disappear is absolutely a spectacular album and well deserving of the number 12 spot on our list this year. Coming in at number 11 is Survival in Motion by Taylor Acorn. And if you've been listening to this podcast since last year, you know that Taylor Acorn is one of my absolute favorite artists in this scene. One of those artists that I just have this profound belief that they are destined for superstardom. And I think Survival in Motion just kind of captures all of that into one complete album. Taylor is one of these artists that has such a cross-genre likability that if I'm trying to show someone a artist or trying to get them into the scene, or when they ask me what type of music I listen to, this is the artist that I'm going to use as my example, because it's very easy to like a track like Greener or People Watching or something along those lines, because it's not as in your face as a Knocked Loose song. It's not as deep as a Sleep Token song. It is fantastic pop rock, pop punk, whatever you want to call this subgenre. And even someone that loves somebody like Taylor Swift is going to enjoy a track like Greener from Taylor Acorn. So that's really where I see this cross-genre likability coming into play. And if we ever want to get back to that mainstream success that we saw with artists being played on mainstream radio, we really need to champion artists like Taylor, because I think she is one of those artists that can really take this scene to the next level. And so that's why Survival in Motion is my number 11 album of the year. So with that, we are at our top 10, and this was extremely difficult. If you see my notebook where I write down kind of what I'm going to say about each individual album or how I rank these, there is scribble marks, there is number changes, there is all kind of chaos when it comes to this album ranking. But this top 10 is definitely one that I am proud of. I am so glad that I got to see a lot of these top 10 bands live this year. And it just really goes to show that when I had so much difficulty choosing my top 10, how great of a year it was for music. So with that, let's just jump into it. Number 10 album of 2024 for me is Liminal by Belmont. Belmont's third album is this pop punk post-hardcore sound, and Belmont is a band that their sound is undeniable. It's unmistakable. You know that the guitars, when they come in, you know immediately who the band is. You know immediately that it's Belmont. And the production on this album is ridiculous. The production on the title track, Liminal, is unbelievable. And even in the track like Two's a Party, where we get a Mr. Krabs ad lib, that's just stuff that you don't hear anymore. That's just stuff that's very unique to Belmont. And one of the best ways that I can describe Belmont's sound is energetic, because even when you're just listening to a song like Liminal and it's not super high tempo, there's still this infectious energy that you get from the vocals and that you get from the sounds that are going on in the background, that it's hard not to headbang along with it. It's hard not to move around with. And so Liminal by Belmont is the number 10 album of 2024. Coming in at number 9 is the self-titled album from State Champs. This is State Champs' 6th album, and State Champs really kind of display their pop punk supremacy here. And pop punk just had another fantastic year in terms of releases from some of the titans of the scene. You know, we had this record from Story So Far. We have this from State Champs. You're going to hear a few more as we get into this top 10. But as far as State Champs goes, I'm not really sure how they continue to do it, but they are continuing to get better with each record. And that's really difficult to do, especially 6 albums in. And start to finish, this is just a solid album. Silver Cloud, I mean, I try not to go track by track in these end of year things because it's just not worth it to do that. When we're talking about an album in its totality, we know that all of the tracks are great. We know that all the tracks really stand out. It's not going to be picking each thing apart, but State Champs from start to finish had one of the best pop punk albums this year, and that's why they land at number 9 on the top 30 albums of 2024 with their self-titled State Champs album. Coming in at number 8 is Things Are Different Now by Rain City Drive. The best way that I can describe this album is polished. Rain City Drive have a polished, clean album here with Things Are Different Now. Obviously, we got potentially one of the biggest tracks of the year with Medicate Me featuring Rory Rodriguez from Dayseeker. That song is undeniable. There's a big opener on this album with Lose My Composure, which really just kind of starts that energetic sound off immediately. And there's a lot of wordplay on display here as well. You know, you get a track like Concrete Closure, and there's all of these different plays on concrete and, you know, having a heart of stone and all these different things. And yeah, I may have a little bit of recency bias here because not only did this album come out more recently, but I got to see Rain City Drive live later in the year this year, and seeing all of this performed live was just unbelievable. But I think the album still lands at this spot because of just how polished it is and just how clean it is when you listen to it, and there's no production blips and there's no issues with anything on this album. So coming in at number 8 this year is Things Are Different Now by Rain City Drive. Coming in at number 7 is For Keeps by Too Close to Touch. This is another one of those final albums from a band, and this is such an emotional record because we know that Too Close to Touch is ending because of the loss of their vocalist. And this album has several songs on it that really just were massive for me this year. The Bad Omens collab and Novocaine is just so hauntingly beautiful that it's one of the top collaborations of the year. The Hopeless track, which is a collaboration with The Word Alive, another really strong track. And then the almost acoustic sound of a track like Heavy Hearts is another beautiful way to bring this band to an end, and bring it to an end that is done on their own terms, and they're releasing what they want to release and gives them a chance to go out on top. I think this record is fantastic, and it was one that I consistently went back to. It was one that I kept saying, you know what, I want to listen to Too Close to Touch right now. I want to listen to that entire record. And so coming in at number 7 this year is For Keeps by Too Close to Touch. Coming in at number 6 is Coup de Grace by See You Space Cowboy. Now look, if you've been listening to me since the beginning, you know that last year you would have never seen an album this heavy, this high on a list for me, because I really wasn't listening to hardcore or metalcore that extensively. But the quality of this specific album is so undeniable that I'm actually kind of surprised that I didn't put this higher. But the top 5 albums were really tough to crack this year. So See You Space Cowboy was an instant favorite for me. And this is the perfect example of vocal blending. I've talked about that a lot this year with Fluorescence and with Heartbent, and now See You Space Cowboy is the exact same. The screams from See You Space Cowboy are something that are so unique that it's hard not to know who is who. And Red Wine and Discontent is one of those tracks that kind of exemplifies that perfectly. And there's really not much I can say about this album. Sometimes there are albums that come out, and there are albums in this scene that you consistently grab for, that you consistently want to go listen to. And you can't necessarily explain why you have this feeling that you're gravitating towards a specific album or a specific artist or a specific song. And that's exactly what it was for me this year with See You Space Cowboy and Coup de Grace. I automatically just kind of fell in love with this sound, and every time I was looking for something a little bit heavier to listen to, I was like, oh, I could listen to Coup de Grace. I could. And that was one that I grabbed for right away. So coming in at number 6 this year is Coup de Grace by See You Space Cowboy. Coming in at number 5 is the self-titled album from Neck Deep. Again, this is another blueprint for pop punk and how to remain relevant and how to take your game to the next level, because Neck Deep gave us an album this year that was just start to finish spectacular. And I think what really stands out about this album specifically is that this album was, I think, the first album that I reviewed this year. To have an album be a January or February release and still have that much of a punch coming into December, where it was almost immediately locked into the top 10 and I just wasn't sure where it was going yet, that's insane to me. That is absolutely incredible that an album has that kind of staying power from January all the way through to the end of the year. Do you know how much music you listen, or someone in my position listens to in a year? How many albums I listen to, how many tracks I listen to, and that Neck Deep was not lost in the shuffle or thrown under the bus and moved on? That is insane to me, and it just goes to show that pop punk really blew it out of the water this year. Look at Neck Deep, look at State Champs, look at Story So Far, look at some of these newer bands that I've already talked about. Again, we have a year where pop punk continues to show that it is still relevant, it is still growing, and it is still something that people want and want to listen to. So coming in at number 5 this year is Neck Deep by Neck Deep. Coming in at number 4 is You Won't Go Before You're Supposed To by Knocked Loose. This is potentially the most impactful release this year, and the screams are unreal, the styles are undeniable. Even non-hardcore fans can appreciate what Knocked Loose is doing, with Suffocate obviously being the main spotlight this year for that band. But I want to talk for a second about the impact that a release like this has. So by now, most people know the story of the title of this album. You know, Brian Garris is on a plane and they're hitting some turbulence, and the old lady next to him says, "Don't worry, you won't go before you're supposed to." And that was the inspiration behind the title of this. I think this can kind of also parallel a band making it to this next level of superstardom, being that you won't make it before you're supposed to. And I think 2024 is the year that Knocked Loose was supposed to make it. And I also think 2024 is the year that hardcore finally got its due diligence and its due respect in the mainstream culture. Specifically, I'm talking about Grammy nomination for Knocked Loose for Suffocate. We got a little bit of it last year with Spirit Box, who's nominated again this year. But then to have Knocked Loose come through in Best Metal Performance with Suffocate is just unreal. And it spotlights really that people are recognizing what these types of bands are doing. People are respecting what these types of bands are doing. And the mainstream better get used to bands like Knocked Loose being around, because they're here to stay. And if you go and you listen to an album like this, you can just feel the change from even just their last couple of EPs or their last couple of singles. You can feel that growth and that almost transformation into, we're big, we're bad, we're here to fucking stay, and we're Knocked Loose. And get fucking used to it, because that's basically what I heard on this entire record. Every time I turned it on, it was like, Knocked Loose is here to stay, and they are here to blow things out of the water. So coming in at number 4 is You Won't Go Before You're Supposed To by Knocked Loose. My top 3 was absolutely miserable to get to, so don't hate me when it's not something that you appreciate, but This was not an easy decision for me. So, coming in at number 3 is Life's Going Great by Games We Play. This is a debut album, and it's very similar to Arrows in Action last year in the sense that it is the best debut album I've heard in a very long time. The opening 3-song stretch of The End, Typical Me, and Girl Shaped Crater is stupid good. And to get 3 heavy-hitting tracks like that right away on an album is something that you don't see very often. Games We Play has this infectious personality, even in live performances, that make this album so much more relatable too. And I think that's a lot of why I kept coming back to this album, is that all of the lyricism on this was something that I could relate to. You know, even a song like Typical Me or Girl Shaped Crater, that is something that I think everybody has experienced at least once in their life. Or even a song like Petty Enemy is something that we've all experienced in our lives. And I think that's why Games We Play is so successful right now, is that they're not afraid to say what's on their mind. They're not afraid to be a little goofy, be a little silly, to have a line in a track that says, I have a small ass dick. Like, those are things that you're not going to hear from anybody other than Games We Play. And I think that's, again, what sets them apart from the rest. So that's what makes Life's Going Great by Games We Play my number 3 album of 2024. Coming in at number 2 is The Black by Imminence. Really, these top 2 albums are a 1A, 1B situation, but this is an absolute masterclass of an album from Imminence. Violin core is something that can be here to stay, but it is always going to be synonymous with Imminence and Eddie Berg. Each track on this album is just an experience because you build up with either an intro or some sort of instrumental, and then you get the story of the track with the lyrics. And then a lot of times you get a outro, which sometimes is kind of just like this wind down, and it's just this soft, smooth sound of some of the guitars, or maybe it's just Eddie playing the violin. And that is what makes this album one of my favorite albums ever. We have a track on there that is one of my favorite tracks of all time, in Death by a Thousand Cuts, because the vocal range on that chorus when he screams cuts is unbelievable. And then you have another huge track like Beyond the Pale. And again, Imminence is one of those bands that it's an experience. It's very similar to Sleep Token last year. You're not going into an Imminence album looking for 1 or 2 tracks that is going to probably be in your tops of the year. But what you are going into is this experience and this feeling of every time I sit down and listen to The Black, this album just captures me and my attention cannot drift at all. I'm just fully immersed in this experience. And the same goes for their live shows as well. You're just fully immersed in what's going on in front of you and how spectacular it is, that it's undeniable why The Black by Imminence is my number 2 album of 2024. Which gets us to the top spot. And this year, the number 1 album of 2024 for Matrix Music Review is The Crucible of Life by the Home Team. This is an album that I talked about during my mid-year album ranking because it happened right as I was releasing the episode, and it came out and I was smacked right across the face and said, oh fuck, now I have a really strong album that's going to be in the top 5, top whatever of the year. Well, that feeling didn't change as this year has gone on, because this has been one of the most undeniably fun records that I've ever listened to in my entire life. The Home Team have achieved such a unique sound, very similar to what I talked about with Belmont, where when a track comes on, you know that it's the Home Team. You know that it's Brian singing vocals, and you know that you're in for a good time. And being able to separate yourself from some of the other bands in the scene is also what sets you apart in terms of being one of the best. And the Home Team are so far separated from the rest of the bands in the scene at this point that they're almost in this next echelon of greatness. because they alter their sounds while still making it unique to them. Because you can get a track like Loud, which we all have heard and loved. Then you can move to a track like Love and Company, which is just a production display, and you get horns and you get some very, very sick guitar riff solos towards the end. And then they slow it down and give you a song like Walk This World With Me, which is just beautiful in its own way. But you're never getting away from what it is, and that is that the home team is just next level stupid good. And I talked about this when I did the album review of Crucible of Life, but to have the lead single Loud so late in the track listing means that you are so confident in how fucking good your songs are that you aren't even worried about putting that single towards the top. Look at most albums and how they're constructed nowadays. Usually the singles are towards the top or one of the first 5 tracks in there. Because what that says is, okay, you know what? Even if they don't like the first 2 or 3, we know that they like the 4th one. So we, at least if we can get them there, then we can get them potentially to listen to the whole thing. The home team said, fuck it, we're putting it at track 10, 11, 12, wherever they put it. And we're that confident in what we have. And guess what? It worked out for them because this album is top to bottom fantastic. And I don't know that my list could have went any other way than ending with the top album of 2024 being The Crucible of Life by the home team. There you have it. That is the top 30 albums of 2024. But before we go, I'm going to talk about some other things really quickly. Some EPs and some singles. And we're going to start with EPs or other albums. This year we had something very unique happen in the sense that we had a album released by Disney with all of our favorite artists called A Whole New Sound. And this was so fun for me to listen to. I am a big Disney fan myself. I actually got to go to Disney shortly after this album was released. And it's just a unique idea to bring some of these bands in the scene together. And I think when you look at that album, you cannot deny how infectious Eye to Eye by Magnolia Park sounds. That song is incredible on its original day, but to add Magnolia Park sound and twist to it is just spectacular. And then to also bring in some of the newer, lesser known artists like Lolo to the scene and let them take one of your biggest songs ever and let it go and do a twist on it. That's incredible. And I'm really excited that they did that. Who knows? Maybe we'll get a volume 2. Maybe this is the new Pop Goes Punk versions that we've been missing for a while now. So hopefully we get to see that. I also want to point out Replica by Dayseeker as just a spectacular experience as well. The acoustic stuff is hard to do for just a normal band, but Dayseeker and Rory do it extremely well. Obviously, everybody was interested to see what they did with My Immortal, which they did a great job with it. But I think Sleep Talk acoustic might be even better, but that's something we can discuss on a different day. EP-wise, we had a lot of newer bands come out with EPs that were really good. We got new EPs from Roderick, which was fantastic. Sunday Morning had a killer EP this year. Tarnish had a good EP this year. Grey Wind had a great EP this year. Stateside had a great single package released. There are a lot of different bands that may not be releasing albums ever, but go look at their EP packages and I'm telling you, you will not be disappointed. As far as some artists or singles that really stood out to me this year, we talked about this before, but Nick Karcher is somebody that I'm always going to have support for and always have faith in. And having a feature from We the Kings this year is just unbelievable. Blame It on the Universe is one of the bigger tracks of the year. Obviously, Gabe Woodrow is somebody that I believe in as well. With 2 releases this year, Live Laugh, Toaster Bath, and then the collab with the Great Heights Band, No Rain, No Flowers, which ended up being one of my top played songs this year. That's an artist that needs to be on everybody's radar. And then as we go down the list, Walwyn had a great track this year. We had some good stuff from Between You and Me this year. Colorblind released a great track called Needle Eye this year. I could go on and on and on about tracks and all these different things, But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a playlist of all of my favorite tracks from this year, and I'm going to link it in the description of this episode, and we're going to call it the best songs of 2024 so that you guys have the best tracks from this year to listen to. And lastly, I just want to highlight all the shows that I went to this year. This was the biggest year for me show-wise that I've ever done, and I got to see some amazing acts live. I talked about being able to see Sum 41's final performance. That was amazing. I got to see Imminence live, which if you ever get the chance, please take it to go see Imminence live. It is an experience like no other. They were with Of Virtue and Catch Your Breath, which are two other really strong bands. I got to see a combination tour from the home team and Arrows in Action, which was out of this world good. That is such a good combination that if they only ever want to tour with each other, that's fine with me. I think we can all agree that those two bands work so well together, so let's just put them on consistent touring schedules together. I got to see Fall Out Boy this year. I got to see Games We Play this year. Got to see Rain City Drive, Unwell. I got to see Stateside. I got to see Belmont. I got to see Can't Swim. I got to see Bearings, Broadside. All these different bands were fantastic this year. And I even got to get a little taste of a festival this year when I went to Let's Go Festival down here in Crownsville, Maryland. And I got to see Gabe Woodrow open up the show. And I got to see Taylor Acorn and Games We Play, People Are Ugly. Got to see Taking Back Sunday, Dashboard Confessional, and was in our first festival setting for Matrix Music Review. But that'll be changing next year. Like I said at the top, I will be attending Warped Tour in DC. I'm hoping to see a lot of people there. I'm hoping that we get a killer lineup for this event. And who knows, maybe we'll have some stuff going on around that time that, we can do meetups or whatever. So that wraps it up for us this year in 2024 for Matrix Music Review. As always, I am super appreciative of you guys coming in and listening, and even more so dealing with that big lull that we had this year. It is something that I don't want to do to you guys again. So hopefully we'll get some new stuff out to you at the beginning of the year, because by the time this drops, we have already gotten new music. I was absolutely loving the new album from Good Hangs, and we'll talk about that, as well as who to look forward to in 2025. We got new tour announcements from bands like My Chemical Romance and Linkin Park. So are we going to get some new stuff from My Chem? Who knows? Probably not, but we'll discuss that at a later date. But as always, the link to any of my social media is in the description of this episode. Instagram's the best way to get in touch with me. If you want to tell me who your top albums were this year, let me know if I missed anybody, or maybe why Bring Me should be in this list as opposed to somebody else. And then if you are on YouTube, go over and subscribe to my YouTube. It is just going to be the audio podcast for now, but as we get into next year, my goal is to do some video related stuff as well. So go over there and subscribe and get moving on that. If you're listening on Apple Music or Spotify, leave a 5-star review. That really does help boost us up and continue to grow our community here. And as always, there's going to be playlists linked in the description of this episode so that you can listen to what I'm listening to. And stay tuned for our 2025 playlist, which will be coming out very shortly, with some songs from the end of this year and the beginning of next year as we get into 2025, which I can only imagine is going to continue to hit just as hard as this year did. With that, I'm out of here, guys. I will see you in 2025. And again, thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of the Matrix Music Review community. And I will see you next time.